A succession of Spanish governors attempted to grow wheat, but other than modest harvest in Appalachian country, the efforts failed. And instead, as Amy Bushnell writes, corn, not maize, was the king of grains in Florida. And just to talk a little bit about wheat, you have to realize that this time in Europe, most European peasants consume most of their calories pre-Columbian Europe was from bread. They ate massive amounts of bread. Italian peasants ate sometimes 5-6 pounds of bread a day. And this was true of most civilizations at the time. You take a complex carbohydrate and then you make it interesting to eat. Bread by itself is not, but you depending where you are in Europe, you spread chicken fat, schmaltz, or olive oil, or rotted anchovies, or peppers, crushed olives to make it interesting. You can't do that in St. Augustine. You can't do that in Florida. There's simply not enough wheat here. So they have to adapt to Indian corn porridge or gruel, cornbread at this time. On a personal note here, when I was in Italy in 1980, I had the opportunity to interview my grandfather's youngest brother. He was about 90 years old. And I asked him, I said, do you remember any letters my grandfather wrote to you? All the Mormino brothers except him went to Napoleonville, Louisiana, a miserable place where they cut sugarcane. And he said, I do. He said, I remember the first letter that arrived because my mother was crying. And in Italian it said, in America, il pane è molle ma la vita è dura. In America, life is hard, but the bread is soft. And what he was, interesting observation, he had never, or most Europeans had never eaten refined white bread before. Refined white bread was for kings at this time. They had eaten whole grain breads, grainy bread, things like that. And I was telling a few of my colleagues here, has anyone here read the novel Giants in the Earth? One person, you win the Rovag Prize in Norwegian literature for 2012. It's, in my mind, it's the greatest immigrant novel. The character, Per Hansa, escapes from Norway. They wind up in the Dakota Territory, and he's homesteading 160 acres of land. And it's the first day of harvest. And it was interesting, I was asked, what piece of literature would I recommend President-elect Barack Obama read? And I said, this passage from Giants in the Earth. To me, this is the purest example of American optimism I think I've read. I'll read here. This is a 1927 novel about life in the 1880s. How could he steal the time to rest these days? The question I'm sure you've asked yourselves. How can I possibly have time for that third latte? Was he not owner of 160 acres of the best land in the world? Wasn't his title to it becoming more firmly established every single day? He gazed at his estate and laughed happily as if at some pleasant and amusing spectacle. Such soil, only to sink the plow into it, to turn over the sod, and there was a field ready for seeding. And this was not ordinary soil, fit for barley and oats and potatoes and hay and that sort of thing. Indeed, it had been meant for much finer and daintier uses. It was the soil for wheat, the king of all grains. Such soil had been especially created by the good Lord to bear this noble seed. And Per Hansa could hardly steal the time to harvest. But that is the American heartlands, not Florida in the 16th century. The other amazing transformation of diet was in terms of carbs and proteins. In the old world, most poor Europeans ate relatively little meat. Most of their diet was carbohydrates. I can remember interviewing dozens of Italian immigrants, and they all told me, I remember one man was Antonio Rancilio. He was a blacksmith, and it's a cold morning, and he's lighting his De Nobili cigar with a burning faggot. And I asked him, why did your father send for you to come to America? He said, He said, my father wrote my mother, in America, I eat meat twice a day, not twice a year. Bring Tony. And what could be... So, but in Florida, meat was much more widely available, particularly wild hogs. So that's one reason Europeans began growing much faster in America than they had. They were quite short coming here, but massive infusion of protein relative to their diet in the old world here. Interestingly, the prototypical Southern diet, what I find interesting about St. Augustine, fast forward 200, 300 years later, the diet has vestiges of the old world. You can have Menorcan gopher stew, which Marjorie Kennan Rawlings writes about in Cross Creek Cookery. The first line of her recipe is decapitate the gopher and discard the entrails. Not exactly a modern cookbook, to say the least. But fried chicken here was considered a noble dish. But interestingly, chicken was relatively rare on most American tables until the latter half of the 20th century. Chickens took a long time to raise. They took a long time to process. Chicken was more expensive than steak. If you go back and look at a grocery ad in 1920s, 1940s market guide. It's not until they really become processed factory style after World War II. I can actually remember going with my mother, I'm sure those of you 60 and older, to poultry stores where you would select a live chicken and return an hour later. As a kid, I'm figuring, now what just happened there? That chicken used to be there an hour ago. But other sources of protein, gophers. Gophers were a real luxury. They called them in the 1930s Hoover chickens. And in one of the more delicious controversies in Florida, one of the most popular dishes in Pensacola had a large Catholic population. On Fridays, they would serve gopher gumbo. It has to be an all-American Florida dish. And the question arose, can Catholics eat gopher? And one of the bishops in Pensacola ruled that gopher was closer to fish than chicken. So yes, gopher is religiously exempt, and Catholics could have their gopher gumbo on Fridays. Geography also determined diet in Florida. Florida is a hard state to get your hands around, if you think about it. Here's the way I like to look at it. Are you giving me a signal? Oh, 5 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. To me, one of the most fascinating questions in the study of Florida is just where does Florida belong? It depends upon your vantage point. If you're in Tallahassee, you're a day's walk from the Georgia border. Tallahassee is deep south. Pecan trees, peach trees, red clay, it's cotton country. 500 miles away is Miami. Miami and Tallahassee don't have a lot in common. Miami has more in common with the Caribbean. Thus is Florida, I would argue Florida is both the southernmost state, but also kind of the northernmost outpost of the Caribbean because of variety. And foodstuffs also went that direction in terms of where you lived in Florida. Let me end this. The Columbian Exchange did not end in 1513. It endures in today's kitchens, cafes, and markets. Shoppers can stroll almost any food aisle and select Thai oyster sauce, balsamic vinegar, tandoori paste, curry spices, Jamaican jerk chicken, Polish pierogies, Laotian spring rolls, bottled mojo marinade. A profusion of new, actually quite old, fruits and vegetables tempt our palates today. Jicama, tomatilla, prickly pear, kiwis, bok chow, Peruvian purple potatoes, mozzarella made from bofalora, and mung beans. Floridians have never enjoyed such varieties of food choices. Floridians who once thought that Chungking and romaine lettuce were exotic now test new dietary frontiers. Consider the fusion possibilities. Curried mullet in rosemary blood orange reduction, South Beach tamales and cheese grits, Mushu swamp cabbage. Beginning in the 1980s, a new Florida cuisine emerged called Nuevo Cubano, Floridian, or Pan Latino. The cooking infuses the ingredients of the Americas, starring Miami as a gateway to the Americas. Of course, Florida cooks, mestiche, criollas, Bridgets, and Mammies, have been doing this for centuries. Witness the popularity of Cuban fried rice, which might seem a weird concoction. The dish originated not in Miami in 1991, but rather in mid-19th century Cuba, with the importation of tens of thousands of Cubans to work on the railroads and sugar plantations. They left behind their imprint and brought their diet to Tampa in the 1890s. You could get Cuban fried rice in Tampa in the 1890s. I'm going to end with this paragraph right here. Fittingly, Florida's oldest eating establishment is the Columbia, the gem of Spanish restaurants. Founded when? 1905. Actually, I found it was 1903, but the owners refused to change the name of the salad. But it is a remarkable institution, and it's just around the corner from here. No dish is more iconic than caldo gallego, Galician soup. The soup contains white beans, greens, ham, broth, and potatoes, the last an homage to the Columbian Exchange. A similar dish, cocido, was served at Florida's first Thanksgiving in 1565. A hearty soup fit for cold Asturian and Galician winters, caldo gallego seems out of place in Florida's hot, humid climate. Gazpacho would seem a much better choice, a cold tomato soup, popular in southern Spain. But Galicians and Asturians, not Andalusians, immigrated to Tampa. Food and memories matter. And thank you very much. I appreciate it.